So what I would like to do is reflect on the meaning of the 4th of July from the perspective of a first-generation immigrant. Now, that has certain meanings. It has the meaning that because I am a first-generation American here in the United States, it means that I know what it's like to live without the liberties and rights that we enjoy here in America. Today, we celebrate the birth of this great country that we call the United States of America. But it's also, for me, very important, a reminder that this great country has been founded on the vision, the passion, and the courage of 12 generations of men and women that in one way or another have put forth tremendous sacrifices, including that of laying down their lives or risking the lives of their families in the pursuit and the protection of the freedoms that we now enjoy. As Americans, we enjoy the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right to peacefully assembly, the right to own property and to have due process, the right to a fair trial, and the right to an impartial jury. And there are others. But I would like to take a few minutes to share with you the experiences that I had specific to these particular freedoms and rights when they were not part of my life. As a child living in a communist country where religious devotion was a threat to the thriving of the new revolution, I experienced firsthand public ridicule, mockery, and persecution for being part of a family that was faithful to their religious beliefs. Every Sunday, my grandmother, who was an amazing matriarch, and my mother dressed us up in our best, and we walked the 5 or 6 blocks from our home through the main part of town to attend the Methodist church. That was our religious affiliation at the time. And that walk was a difficult walk every Sunday because the government intentionally planned all of their social activities in the plaza in front of the church. It was noisy, it was attractive, it was enticing, especially for me, 5 years old, my cousin, 7 years old, to watch all of our friends participating in all of the things that would never have a chance to do except during that time. And I remember as we walked by, there were certain terms that were used for dissident families like mine. We were called worms, because a worm, a gusano, as we say it in Spanish, is something so low that it lives underground. So that was a very derogatory term that would be yelled at us as we walked to church every Sunday. And my grandmother, who was very strong, she would hold our hands tight and whisper in a low voice, "Put your shoulders back, hold your head up high, and you keep walking." And we did that every Sunday. I lived in a country where any form of public or private expression of dissent about the government would most likely land you in jail or result in death. Let me give you a few examples from our family. My father's oldest brother, who followed the military tradition of his father, an officer in the Calgary in Cuba, was a young man, had a beautiful wife and a 5-year-old, And as the revolution was getting started, one day, as part of his daily routines, he and his family would take an afternoon stroll in the park near their home. And as he stepped out of his home, his wife and his daughter following behind, the revolutionary gang came by and shot him right in front of his wife and his daughter, just because he was part of the military, of the establishment. My mother's youngest brother, a young professor at one of the universities in Cuba, ended up serving 5 years in a very harsh prison in the province of Oriente. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Oriente. That's where the US base is. And because he had arranged for peaceful assembly of protest with his students against the revolution. He spent 5 years in solitary confinement. My father's youngest brother, who lived on the other end of the island, owned a business, and he felt that it was his right to post some signs questioning some of the decisions and actions being proposed by the new government. As a result of that, he ended up in a very harsh prison in solitary confinement for 11 years. That caused him to miss the birth of his second child, his only daughter, who he did not get to meet until she was 13 years old. When he finally came out of prison, and his wife, who was very determined to see that their children had a better life, took it upon herself to come to this country alone with those 2 children. Let's look at the right of a fair trial and access to an impartial jury. My grandmother's neighbor, for example, a young engineer who has studied here in the United States but wanted to return home to exercise his profession in his country, went to work one day, apparently was accused that day of being involved in some industrial sabotage attempt, and instead of having notice to the family, an opportunity to hire an attorney, to look into the evidence, instead he was taken directly from his work to a closed trial and without representation, and that afternoon was shot at the local movie theater. We were noticed as family and friends when his body was delivered to the home. Shortly after the revolution took over in control of the country, something very different happened. All of our properties were confiscated, and I mean all. All private property was transferred to the ownership of the government. So the home that we lived in was no longer our home. It was the government's home. Our family's sugarcane plantations and refineries were no longer our property. They were the property of the government. Our bank accounts were confiscated, our homes, even our belongings. And what I mean by our belongings is any family like mine, who by this time had clearly identified itself as a dissident family, literally would have the government committee come in and take an inventory of everything that was in my home, from paintings to couches to ornaments in the house, anything that was recorded. Today in our country, we have the right to read anything We can take a topic and read articles and listen to perspectives that are pro, against, and neutral. In Cuba, shortly after the regime took over, something very unique happened. All of our bookstores' inventories dwindle very quickly because all of a sudden, any type of printed material that in any way did not or could in any possible way be perceived as not being supportive of the Marxist communist ideology was no longer permitted to be housed in any of our bookstores. I think even more offensively was the fact that our libraries, public libraries, school libraries, and even university libraries went through this process of censorship. My cousins, who later on attended the university under the regime, would request for us to send them literature that they could not access in Cuba, and we would send it to them few pages at a time in letter envelopes so that they could then compile the book over time and then share and pass the book around underground to read the books. It has been said that we oftentimes don't appreciate what we have until we no longer have it. I think I am privileged over some of you because I know what it's like not to have what we have. And I don't wish upon any of you to lose what you have. But because I didn't have these freedoms and rights, I feel that I have a heightened appreciation for those freedoms and rights that we enjoy. For me, going into a voting booth is so much more than it is for most of you. Because when I stand there in that booth and I see my name and the right to punch and express my views, I have a rush of memories of all the sacrifices that my family made so that I could be there in that booth that day. And that never goes away. Saturday, I think it was Sunday, Brother Sellers talked about the marvel that it is to have the opportunity to visit these amazing countries that our world has and to interact with the amazing people of the world and how much he enjoys that. But he also talked about that wonderful feeling of appreciation and gratitude that he has when he steps back into this country, and that sense that your landing in America has something that stirs his heart. For me, that is a very emotional entry every time I come in, and I travel all the time. I travel for work, and I travel for leisure, and I love the places that I visit, but there isn't a time that I don't come back and have those stirrings of my heart when I land in this country. Because yeah, there are great things out there and there are great countries, but what we have here is so much better than what others have. My other question was, how much do you value what you have? What are you willing to sacrifice for what you have? Patrick Henry's words, "Give me liberty or give me death," resonates in the lives of my parents as something that they understood. They connected with those words. They knew from experience that the human spirit cannot thrive where freedoms do not exist. And they joined the ranks of many men and women whose vision, passion, and courage drove them to make the greatest sacrifices in the pursuit of freedom and democracy. When I was 5, my parents made that choice. Give me liberty or give me death. And they decided that they were going to risk it and that we were going to do an attempt to escape the country. Now that's a lot. I'm a parent now, and I don't know if I would have had the courage to take that step, knowing that yes, it was a chance to give my child the future that they deserved. But at the same time, there was the risk that a lot could go wrong. We tried, and a lot went wrong. We were caught. We went through a horrific few days where we experienced sheer terror as we were chased down the beaches, the dark beaches one night with machine gun following us, to 3 or 4 days of being searched by the militia in all the area where we were, until finally being caught. My father went to prison for 2 years. During those 2 years, the United States government, under the Johnson administration in Cuba, reached an agreement and afforded Cuban citizens the opportunity to apply on the basis of quotas if they had families in the United States who could become responsible for them to apply to leave the country. Well, there was a floodgate of Cubans who, many of them had families here, to apply to leave the country. You also need to understand that any family that had a male child was particularly under pressure, because under the Cuban law, a male child who turned 15 was of military age. And between the ages of 15 and 27, even if your family received permission to leave the country, that male child between the ages of 15 and 27 was now a property of the government because they were of military age and they could not leave the country. That cost a lot of Cuban families to do the craziest of things. For example, have a cousin who's like a brother to me, and his family knew that if they waited for the quota, he would not be able to leave. So they reach out to somebody that they knew, somebody that knew somebody in Spain who was kind enough and willing enough to give the money to buy a ticket to a flight that came twice a week from Madrid to Cuba. And they put my 13-year-old cousin on that plane by himself with no one at the other end to receive him. No one. So you think about, as a parent, and this is a long time ago where communication is not like it is today. We didn't have cell phones to check when he got on the other end. Just to put him on a plane and just get him out of the country and hope that somebody would take mercy on him on the other end. Thank goodness there was a Catholic priest in Madrid out of the Escorial, which many of you probably are familiar with, who became aware of this Cuban crisis. And he took it upon himself to walk the Madrid airport twice a week and pick up all these Cuban boys that were arriving without parents. He created an orphanage, and he would keep him there until their parents could arrive in the United States raise enough money, and then reunite with their families. That was the case of my 13-year-old cousin, getting my English and my Spanish confused. Another example in the family, my father's sister had 2 boys, a younger one and an older one. And that family had to make the decision to have the mother leave with a younger child, and the father stayed with the one that was of military age. That family was never again reunited. They were split forever. They're family, but they were split forever. After my father went to prison, and this opportunity came up, the decision was that my mother and I would apply. But we were very afraid to have my father apply, because oftentimes that triggered a much more punitive prison state. And so they made that choice. My dad would wait till he would come out of prison to apply to be part of the quota, and we did that. My mother and I received our permission to leave the country, and remember that inventory that I told you that was taken once we were identified as a dissident family. When it was time for my mother and for me to leave, that same team came back in with a list of the inventory, and they checked everything that was supposed to be left in our home. We were only allowed to leave with 7 counted changes of clothing, and not even our family pictures. My father came out of prison, applied, and as soon as he applied, he was reassigned, not to his job as a CPA that he was, but rather as to work camps, digging ditches all around the country. He was only allowed to come home every 2 weeks for a day and a half to take care of personal things and then go back out. He did that for 7 years. My mother and I arrived in the United States and began to put our lives together, living day by day with the hope that we would be reunited as a family. The freedom flights were coming to an end. They were going to be closed on December 31st. I believe it was 74. And my mother bought a little radio that she would take to work with her, because twice a day there were 2 flights, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And every Cuban family that had a member on the wait list would carry this little radios, and they would listen to the local Cuban station, who had as its first mission to have a reporter as that airplane landed, because we never knew who was coming. And so the first news of who was on that plane was reported by the Cuban station there in Miami. As the passengers would be coming down, they would be taking names and reading them over the radio. And so my mother religiously listened to that list of names in the morning and in the afternoon. She was desperate. She really was desperate. I never seen her so unraveled. As the 29th arrived and the 30th came, and my father hadn't come. But that afternoon of the 30th, there was only going to be 1 flight on the 31st. And that afternoon, on the 30th, my father's name was read. And the many years of struggle in our pursuit of freedom as a family became a reality. As immigrants who sacrificed so much to come to this country, we are swelled with gratitude as the foundation of the feelings of patriotism that we feel. See, I was really put together when I came here this morning, until the colors were posted and until the patriotic music was played. Because other than my faith and my family, there is nothing I value more than being a citizen of this country and knowing that my children and my grandchildren have access and have the right to these freedoms. There's a song that says, "We are proud to stand next to you and call ourselves American because we too love this land, the USA, and we never take its freedoms for granted, for we have known life without them." I hope that the stories, the more recent stories of the sacrifices that people make to have what we own, what we have, will motivate us to have a greater appreciation and a greater commitment to stand up for these privileges that are ours as American. So happy 4th of July to you and to all Americans. Thank you.